The paper lanterns had been strung with particular care that evening, creating a constellation of gentle light along the path to St. Bartholomew's Church. Little moons and stars danced between the ancient yew trees, casting their benevolent glow over what promised to be Ashdown St. Luke's most ambitious fundraising event of the year. The Moonlight Hymns and Puddings Evening, a charming novelty designed to restore the church tower's failing chimes, had drawn the entire village from their comfortable sitting rooms into the mild summer dusk. Miss Jane Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead at the enthusiastic invitation of her dear friend Mrs. Emmeline Pierce, occupied an unassuming chair near the lemonade urn. Her position afforded her an excellent view of the proceedings while maintaining the appearance of a harmless elderly lady, simply enjoying the evening's entertainment. Years of observing human nature had taught her that the most revealing dramas often unfolded in the margins of social gatherings, where people believed themselves unobserved. The players assemble. The evening's centerpiece was undoubtedly Mr. Felix Hart, the new choir master who had arrived from London in February with impressive credentials and modern ideas. Tall and polished, with hair like a smooth sweep of ink, he moved through the gathering with the confident air of one accustomed to being the most cultured person in the room. His blue cassocks for the choir boys had caused quite a stir among the more traditional villagers, though none could argue with the results he achieved. "Felix is very particular about his arrangements," Mrs. Pierce whispered to Miss Marple, her admiration evident. "Lady Templeton says he's transformed our little muddles into proper music." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the boy who would be performing the evening's featured solo. Alfred Winter, barely 12 years old, moved carefully between the tables in his surplice, balancing refreshments with the gravity of a young acolyte. His fair hair caught the lantern light like spun silver, and there was something almost ethereal about his concentration as he prepared for what everyone knew would be his final performance as a treble. His voice was already showing signs of the change that would end his soprano days. Mrs. Winter, Alfred's mother, stood somewhat apart from the cheerful clusters near the vestry door. A neat woman with the precise posture of someone who spent her mornings behind the post office counter, she watched her son with a mixture of pride and barely concealed anxiety. Her hands constantly worried at her handbag, opening and closing it in small, nervous gestures that spoke of a mother's protective instincts. Tensions beneath the surface. Miss Eleanor Gray, the church organist, presented a study in barely contained indignation. A slight, angular woman with an air of long proprietorship over musical matters, she stood like a folded bird at the church door, her summer gloves incongruous in the warm evening air. "The Nunc Dimittis page has been removed from my folder," she informed Mrs. Pierce with vibrating precision. "Deliberately removed. One doesn't simply misplace music one has been rehearsing for 3 weeks." The grievance was clearly directed at Mr. Hart, whose insistence on his own arrangements had ruffled more than a few traditional feathers. When confronted about the missing page, Hart's response was a model of controlled politeness that somehow managed to be more irritating than outright dismissal. Mr. Jack Briggs, the bell ringer, represented another source of friction. A large, indignant man bred from walnut and soap, he protested vigorously when Mrs. Lydia Penrose, the vicar's young, efficient wife, requested that the bell tower be locked for safety during the evening's festivities. "I've rung this parish through armistice and coronations," he declared with wounded dignity, "and I'll ring her through a pudding supper. Mark me." The keys were eventually surrendered by Mr. Hart, with theatrical reluctance, a small gesture that nonetheless established his authority over the evening's proceedings. The performance begins. As the village settled into the softer, more ambiguous light of candles held in small saucers, the atmosphere shifted from social gathering to something approaching the sacred. The choir processed in their blue cassocks and white surplices, looking like foam on a dark sea. Alfred Winter's hands showed the slightest tremor as he took his position, his thumb and forefinger rubbing together in a nervous gesture that only the most observant would notice. The first hymns rolled out like daylight, voices finding their places and settling into the familiar rhythms of worship. Miss Marple noted the small economies of behavior that never lie. The way Mr. Pottle, the fussy verger, constantly readjusted the hymn-board cards. How Lady Templeton lifted her chin for each opening note as if she too were performing. The photographer Martindale's smarming attention to the boys, promising them posterity and fame in the county newspaper. The fatal moment. At 11:58, a profound hush settled over the gathering as Miss Grey's hands found the keys for the Nunc Dimittis. Despite the missing page, she had managed to arrange an accompaniment for the ancient prayer of dismissal. Alfred's descant was meant to soar like a small star over the traditional melody, and as he lifted his chin and set his mouth, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. The first notes were pure as crystal, steady and true. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Winter's face empty itself of everything but listening, while Mr. Hart's eyes closed in appreciation of an effect of his own making. The note climbed, held, and for a moment seemed to touch something celestial. Then, as the church clock began its measured progression toward midnight, something went terribly wrong. Alfred's hand moved to his throat. Not the nervous gesture Miss Marple had observed earlier, but something urgent and frightened. The pure note wavered, became strangled, then dissolved into a bewildered sound that was neither music nor speech. The boy took half a step, stumbled on his surplice, and crumpled to the flagstones with a small, terrible sound. As the clock struck its 12th and final chime, proclaiming the arrival of midnight, Alfred Winter lay motionless beneath the ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's, his voice silenced forever. The aftermath. The collective intake of breath seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Mrs. Winter's animal cry of distress cut through the shocked stillness as she pushed forward. The vicar called out to the Almighty, while Mr. Hart stood frozen, his conductor's hand still raised as if the music might somehow continue. Miss Marple did not hurry. She stood because propriety required it, but her eyes were already cataloguing the reactions around her. Mr. Pottle's furtive dart to the vestry door and his quick closure of it, as if containing some disorder. The photographer's odd glance toward the side aisle before he lifted and lowered his camera, suddenly scrupulous about the appropriateness of documentation. The way various villagers positioned themselves in relation to the tragedy, some drawing closer, others instinctively stepping back. When someone called for the doctor, the futility was immediately apparent. Dr. Drake lived in Market Hafton and came only on Thursdays or for emergencies that could be properly summoned. There was no doctor, only the terrible certainty that help, when it arrived, would be too late. Miss Marple knelt beside the boy, her mild voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "Give him air," she said, and people drew back in automatic response. She looked at the pale, astonished face and the small nick of blood where his head had struck the stone. But it was the faint, medicinal scent that didn't belong in the hymn-sweet air that caught her attention, something that spoke of deliberate intervention rather than natural tragedy. As the village shifted uncertainly on its feet, and the ancient words of dismissal hung unspoken between pillar and pew, Miss Marple glanced once at Mr. Hart's very careful hands, then at the firmly shut vestry door. In her long experience, she had learned that it takes only the smallest hand upon the scale to alter the balance of a village. The tremor, though, is felt by everyone. And in that first awful minute after midnight, when no one knew quite what had happened, Miss Marple knew only this. Something had been done, and done quite deliberately. The choir boy who had died at midnight had not simply succumbed to natural causes. He had been silenced by human intention, and the truth lay hidden somewhere among the familiar faces now staring in shock at the scene before them. The investigation, she realized, with the quiet certainty that had served her well in previous mysteries, was about to begin. The constable arrived at 20 minutes past midnight, wheeling his bicycle through the churchyard gate with the measured deliberation of a man roused from comfortable sleep. Police Constable Williams was a methodical individual who approached village disturbances with systematic attention, though nothing in his experience had prepared him for a death during evening service. He surveyed the scene with professional gravity, noting witness positions, the overturned hymnal, and the small puddle of spilled lemonade near Alfred's music stand. Dr. Drake, summoned from Market Hafton, confirmed what was already grimly apparent. His examination was brief but thorough, his pronouncement delivered with a mournful shake of the head that seemed to deepen the pall over St. Bartholomew's. Natural causes. Most likely, Constable Williams declared after consulting with the doctor. Young lads strain themselves with high notes. Heart gives out or some medical matter. These things happen, though it's terrible sad. Mrs. Winter had been led to the vestry, where she sat in numbed silence, occasionally making small, broken sounds that might have been prayers. When Mrs. Pierce brought tea, Mrs. Winter held the cup without drinking and said to no one in particular, "He hates those throat pastilles people press on him, says they make him numb and taste of camphor. Alfred only took lemonade this evening. He knew not to eat before singing." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant, though she kept her reaction carefully neutral. The boy's water glass, she had noted, stood empty beside his music stand, despite Mrs. Pierce distinctly remembering filling it minutes before the performance. The village theories take shape. Lady Templeton, preferring events to be stately and death to be elsewhere, declared to her circle that boys of Alfred's age often overexerted themselves. They are all nerve and ambition, a weak heart, very likely. Such delicate constitutions these days. This comfortable explanation assigned tragedy without suggesting malice, and the village seemed eager to embrace it. Miss Eleanor Gray, her earlier indignation now eclipsed by horror, spoke in clipped, precise tones. He was gifted but highly strung. The pressure of that demanding solo, perhaps, or the stress of performing without proper preparation, thanks to certain disruptions to my arrangements. Her implication, though veiled, pointed directly at Mr. Hart's methods. Mr. Hart himself demonstrated controlled distress, kneeling briefly beside Alfred before rising with a carefully measured sigh. A terrible shock. Alfred was exceptional talent. Perhaps he pushed himself too hard for tonight's performance. His words, while sorrowful, deflected potential blame from his rigorous training. Mr. Pottle, the verger, maintained a different view entirely. He stood by the vestry door, casting furtive glances at the choir master. Odd business, this. Never seen a boy drop like that, and young Alfred was lively as a cricket. Too much newfangled music disturbs the natural order. When Constable Williams requested nothing be disturbed until further examination, Pottle's defensiveness seemed excessive. Martin Dale, already envisioning newspaper headlines, moved discreetly among the mourners. His nervousness seemed disproportionate, and his eyes kept returning to the side chapel where the choir had vested. "Did anyone notice signs he was unwell earlier, sir?" he asked the vicar, his question seemingly innocent, but designed to gather compelling details. Subtle observations. Miss Marple positioned herself near the font, appearing to seek quiet recovery while actually observing reactions to official pronouncements. The medicinal scent she had detected near Alfred's body had dissipated, but she remained certain of what she had smelled. More puzzling was Mr. Pottle's unusual efficiency in tidying the chancel, gathering books with nervous energy despite official requests to leave things undisturbed. Mrs. Pierce, drawn into quiet conversation, revealed another troubling detail. Alfred had been rather withdrawn this past week. His mother mentioned he'd been having trouble sleeping, asking odd questions about whether promises made to adults always had to be kept. This intelligence struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. In her experience, children who asked such questions had encountered adult behavior that troubled their natural sense of right and wrong. The timing of Alfred's distress, so close to his final performance, suggested whatever had been weighing on his mind connected directly to the church, the choir, or the people associated with both. Jack Briggs, still fuming about his confiscated tower keys, engaged anyone willing to listen in detailed explanations of why memorial bells should have been rung. His insistence seemed excessive, and Miss Marple wondered if his desire to access the tower stemmed from genuine grief or other motivation entirely. As the evening wore toward its grim conclusion, with arrangements being made for Alfred's removal and the gradual dispersal of shocked villagers, Miss Marple found herself cataloguing small deceptions and nervous behaviors others seemed determined to ignore. The village was reacting with comfortable explanations, but human nature, she knew from long experience, rarely allowed for such simple, uncomplicated endings. Morning came pale and subdued over Ashdown St. Luke, the village wrapped in that peculiar hush which follows unexpected tragedy. The churchyard retained its scent of cut grass and lingering candle wax, while a persistent wasp investigated the sticky residue on the chancel steps where something sweet had dried overnight. Miss Marple, presenting herself at the church under the innocent pretext of retrieving a mislaid prayer book, found Constable Williams completing his methodical examination, with the satisfied air of a man whose conclusions aligned comfortably with official expectations. Natural causes, most likely, he confirmed, tucking his notebook away with finality. Dr. Drake's seen it before. Young lads pushing themselves too hard with demanding music. Heart gives out, or some such medical matter. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while her keen eyes catalogued details others had overlooked. Alfred's water glass had been removed, but the faint circle it left on the wooden music stand told an interesting story. The residue was tacky to the touch, and tiny grains caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Mrs. Pierce had distinctly mentioned filling the boy's glass from the tap just before the procession began. Water, however, left no sugar. In the vestry, she discovered Miss Eleanor Gray conducting what appeared to be an inventory of musical arrangements with unusual intensity. The organist's precise movements suggested someone searching for evidence of tampering rather than simple tidying. "The missing page from my folder was not misplaced," Miss Gray declared with vibrating certainty. "Someone deliberately removed the Nunc Dimittis arrangement, forcing me to improvise accompaniment for Alfred's solo." More intriguing was the brown medicine bottle Miss Marple noticed among the cleaning supplies on the windowsill. Its label read, "Balm of Gilead liniment," something used for aching joints from bell ropes or organ work. When she discreetly tested its scent, the sharp medicinal note was remarkably similar to what she had detected near Alfred's body the previous evening, though this was cleaner, less cloying. Village revelations. At Hartwell's bakery, Mrs. Pierce was collecting the morning bread when Mrs. Dobson leaned across the counter with the confidential air of one sharing vital intelligence. "That photographer fellow was asking peculiar questions yesterday, before the service even began. Wanted to know which boys would be featured prominently, who their families were, whether any had particular talents worth documenting. Almost like he was selecting them for something specific." This information struck Miss Marple as significant. In her experience, excessive interest in a victim's circumstances often indicated foreknowledge rather than journalistic curiosity. At the post office, Mrs. Winter had returned to work despite her grief, her hands moving mechanically through the morning correspondence. "Alfred had been troubled lately," she confided, her voice carrying a bewildered edge. "Not about his singing, he loved that, but about something he called the secret. Said grown-ups sometimes asked children to keep quiet about things that didn't feel right, even when keeping quiet felt wrong too." The emphasis Mrs. Winter placed on Alfred's honesty struck Miss Marple as particularly telling. He wouldn't lie, Miss Marple. Whatever was troubling him, he was trying to do the right thing, even though it frightened him. Suspicious behaviors. Mr. Pottle's morning routine included an unusually thorough scrubbing of the chancel area, his movements jerky with barely contained anxiety. "Important to maintain proper standards," he declared when Miss Marple complimented his diligence. "Can't have outsiders thinking we're careless about sacred spaces." His emphasis on outsiders seemed pointed, and his nervous glances toward the vestry suggested specific concerns about what might be discovered there. Most revealing was his reaction when she mentioned Alfred's evident dedication. "Boys these days are too curious for their own good," Pottle muttered, scrubbing the flagstones with vigorous determination. "Always arriving early, staying late, poking about where they oughtn't. Alfred was no different, always noticing things that weren't his concern." Mr. Hart, meanwhile, was conducting his own systematic examination of the choir's music folders, his explanation about ensuring nothing had been disturbed during the tragedy seeming reasonable until one observed his excessive nervousness when interrupted. Alfred's folder, Miss Marple noted, contained several loose sheets bearing annotations in adult handwriting before Hart quickly returned it to its proper place. The pattern emerges. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had detected a consistent thread. Alfred Winter had been observant, conscientious, and recently burdened by adult knowledge that conflicted with his natural moral compass. Multiple villagers had noted his changed behavior, though none had pressed for details. More significantly, several adults connected to the church demonstrated unusual anxiety about what Alfred might have witnessed or understood. Settling on a bench in the churchyard, Miss Marple processed these various threads with the methodical patience that had served her well in previous mysteries. Children, she knew, often saw clearly what adults preferred to keep hidden. Alfred, with his regular church attendance and naturally observant temperament, would have been ideally positioned to witness behavior others assumed went unnoticed. The question now was determining exactly what secret had burdened him so greatly, and which adult had found that knowledge dangerous enough to require permanent silence through such carefully calculated means. The official inquest concluded with reassuring swiftness, Dr. Drake's testimony confirming natural causes, and Constable Williams closing his notebook with visible relief. The coroner's verdict of cardiac arrest, brought on by vocal strain, satisfied the legal requirements, and the village seemed eager to embrace this comfortable explanation. Yet Miss Marple observed that communities which rushed toward tidy conclusions often did so to avoid examining untidy truth lurking beneath their well-maintained surfaces. The obvious suspect emerges. By weekend's end, village opinion had crystallized around a single compelling target. Mr. Felix Hart, with his London sophistication and modern methods, had always remained slightly apart from Ashdown St. Luke's established rhythms. Now, these very qualities were reinterpreted as evidence of dangerous ambition and callous disregard for traditional values. Mrs. Penrose, the vicar's efficient wife, led this chorus of suspicion with characteristic precision. "His demands on those boys were excessive," she declared to anyone willing to listen. "Late rehearsals, complicated arrangements, pressure to achieve professional standards. Alfred was sensitive. Such intensity was bound to prove harmful." Her certainty carried the weight of someone who had observed Hart's methods with growing disapproval. Miss Eleanor Gray provided more specific accusations. He disrupted established procedures, insisted on his own compositions, created an atmosphere of competition rather than worship. Alfred bore the brunt of his ambitions. That demanding solo was designed to showcase Hart's abilities, not the boy's natural gifts. Her professional authority lent credence to these charges, and her long tenure at St. Bartholomew's made her opinions influential. Even Mr. Pottle contributed damaging observations. Always changing things, that one, moving choir practice to evenings, keeping boys late without proper supervision. Not natural, I say. Boys need routine, not constant innovation. His nervous energy while speaking suggested relief at having identified a suitable culprit. building the circumstantial case. The evidence against Hart seemed to accumulate naturally. Several parents recalled feeling uneasy about his intensive training methods and his insistence on private coaching sessions. Lady Templeton mentioned Hart's dismissive attitude toward parental concerns, his claim that artistic achievement required sacrifice from both performers and families. More troubling was the revelation that Hart had been observed in the church at unusual hours, ostensibly preparing for performances, but often found in areas unrelated to musical activities. Jack Briggs reported seeing Hart near the bell tower on multiple occasions, despite having no apparent business there. Timothy Fletcher, another choir member, provided the most damaging testimony. Hart had singled out Alfred for special attention, he claimed, praising the boy's potential while simultaneously criticizing his technique in ways that seemed designed to create anxiety rather than improvement. Alfred started worrying about disappointing Mr. Hart. Timothy confided with the earnest precision of a child witness. Miss Marple's growing doubts. While the village embraced this explanation with evident relief, Miss Marple found their eagerness troubling rather than convincing. In her considerable experience, genuine guilt rarely presented itself so conveniently, and communities that rushed to identify outsiders as culprits often did so to avoid examining more uncomfortable possibilities closer to home. The physical evidence continued to puzzle her systematic mind. The medicinal scent near Alfred's body, the sticky residue on his music stand, the boy's recent reference to keeping adult secrets. None of these details aligned with Hart's supposed crime of excessive ambition leading to tragic overexertion. Moreover, Hart's reaction seemed genuinely shocked rather than guilty. His cooperation with official inquiries appeared complete and unstudied, lacking the careful calculation she would expect from someone concealing deliberate harm. The bell tower revelation, her doubts crystallized during a quiet conversation with Mrs. Winter, who mentioned almost casually that Alfred had been spending considerable time in the bell tower recently. He said he was helping Mr. Briggs with something important, she explained, her grief-dulled voice carrying new uncertainty. But he was always vague about the details, which wasn't like Alfred. He usually explained everything he was learning. This information struck Miss Marple as significant. The bell tower, with its isolation and overlooked position, would provide ideal circumstances for activities requiring privacy. Briggs's excessive concern about his confiscated keys now seemed less like wounded pride and more like genuine anxiety about access being restricted. The convenient solution. As Inspector Craddock prepared to question Hart more formally, Miss Marple reflected on the village's collective satisfaction with their chosen suspect. The obvious culprit, she had learned through long experience, was often precisely that, too obvious for comfort. Hart's guilt would allow the community to attribute Alfred's death to an outsider's harmful influence, preserving their comfortable assumptions about their own innocence and the village's inherent safety. But children like Alfred, she knew, rarely died from adult ambition alone. They died when they discovered adult secrets that someone found too dangerous to allow them to keep. The morning light filtered through St. Bartholomew's ancient windows with the pale clarity that follows tragedy, illuminating details previously obscured by evening shadows and communal shock. Miss Marple, ostensibly retrieving a mislaid prayer book, found herself conducting a more systematic examination of the scene, while Constable Williams completed his perfunctory investigation with the satisfied air of a man whose conclusions aligned comfortably with official expectations. The evidence speaks. Her attention was immediately drawn to Alfred's music stand, where the faint tackiness she had noticed the previous evening told a more complex story in daylight. The residue formed a delicate ring where a glass had stood, but tiny crystalline grains caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. When she discreetly tested a flake, between her fingers, the texture was distinctly granular rather than the smooth stickiness of dried lemonade. More significantly, raising the sample to her nose revealed that same medicinal coolness she had detected near Alfred's body, something mentholated and deliberately administered. Beneath the organ bench, almost invisible against the dark floorboards, lay a small triangle of paper that had escaped the previous evening's hurried cleaning. Miss Marple coaxed it free with the gentle persistence of someone accustomed to finding significance in overlooked details. The fragment bore the remnants of musical notation on one side and a portion of Latin text. Mittis, on the other, clearly torn from Miss Gray's missing Nunc Dimittis arrangement. Most revealing was the paper's curved shape, formed into the memory of a cone, with its tip stiff from something that had dried and crystallized. The makeshift funnel told its own story of careful preparation and practical improvisation. Someone had needed to deliver a granular substance with precision, using whatever materials were immediately available. The torn choir page served perfectly for guiding powder into a waiting glass, explaining both the missing music and the suspicious residue. Scientific revelation. A discreet inquiry at the village chemist provided the missing piece of the puzzle. Mr. Hemlock's enthusiastic description of popular throat remedies for singers included pastilles containing mild local anesthetics, menthol, and eucalyptus. Very effective for performers, he explained, offering a sample tin. The numbing effect soothed the throat while clearing the passages. The distinctive medicinal aroma was unmistakable, precisely what Miss Marple had detected at the scene. More significantly, these pastilles dissolved into a sticky, granular residue that would effectively mask other substances while providing legitimate reason for their presence near a young singer. Alfred's well-known dislike of such remedies made their use particularly suspicious, suggesting deliberate administration rather than voluntary consumption. The bell tower connection. Jack Briggs' excessive concern about his confiscated keys began to make disturbing sense when connected to Alfred's recent visits to the bell tower. Mrs. Winter's casual mention that her son had been helping with important work that required discretion revealed a pattern of manipulation designed to secure the boy's cooperation and silence. Miss Marple discovered additional evidence when she noticed a parish tea towel stuffed into the gap beneath the tower door, ostensibly to prevent drafts. The towel bore the vicarage laundry's identifying red thread, and its lower edge was stiff with dried residue that carried the same lemony medicinal scent. Someone had used the tower for activities requiring both privacy and cleanup, with Alfred serving as an unwitting accomplice. The photographer's anxiety. Martin Dale's behavior grew increasingly erratic as official attention focused on Hart. His repeated returns to the church, ostensibly for memorial documentation, demonstrated unusual interest in areas where Alfred had spent time. More telling was his nervous energy when discussing the boy's recent activities, particularly any mention of the bell tower. "Boys that age are always exploring," he said with careful dismissiveness when Miss Marple mentioned Alfred's tower visits. His hands stilled on his camera equipment, and his eyes darted toward the tower door with unmistakable apprehension. The photographer's eagerness to reinforce suspicions against Hart seemed designed to deflect attention from his own activities. Pattern of manipulation. Timothy Fletcher's additional recollections provided crucial insight into Alfred's psychological state. The boy had spoken of grown-ups doing things that weren't right, even in church, and of being asked to maintain secrets that made him feel sick inside. Most significantly, Alfred had described the manipulation as subtle rather than threatening. Someone who explained why it was important, gave him special privileges, made him feel important. This sophisticated approach suggested patient grooming rather than simple coercion. The perpetrator had cultivated Alfred's trust over time, gradually involving him in questionable activities before the boy's moral compass began asserting itself more strongly. Alfred's changing voice and ending role in the choir represented a dangerous transition, A boy losing his special position might feel less obligated to maintain adult secrets. The fatal timing. Miss Marple understood that Alfred's death came precisely when his usefulness was ending and his silence becoming uncertain. The throat pastilles, dissolved in his lemonade using the improvised paper funnel, would have provided both the numbing effect to mask any bitter taste and the legitimate medical explanation for their presence. The bell tower activities, whatever their nature, required Alfred's cooperation and discretion, cooperation that was becoming increasingly reluctant as the boy matured morally. The village's eager embrace of Hart as the obvious suspect served the true perpetrator's purposes perfectly, allowing someone with deeper connections to the community to escape scrutiny. Miss Marple recognized the pattern she had observed in previous cases. The outsider blamed while the insider remained safely hidden among familiar faces and comfortable assumptions. As she folded the incriminating towel with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to preserving evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the calculated nature of the crime. This was not passionate violence or sudden opportunity, but careful planning designed to eliminate a threat while appearing entirely natural. The killer had used Alfred's own environment against him, turning the boy's dedication to his church duties into the mechanism of his destruction. The investigation, she realized with quiet certainty, was moving beyond the comfortable realm of obvious suspects into the more treacherous territory of hidden motivations and carefully maintained facades. Someone in Ashdown St. Luke had been using the bell tower for purposes that required a child's assistance and silence. And when that silence became uncertain, they had chosen murder disguised as natural tragedy. The afternoon brought an unexpected convergence at the church when Miss Marple arrived to return the borrowed prayer book, only to discover several villagers already present, each claiming legitimate business that seemed curiously urgent. The gathering felt less coincidental than orchestrated by the peculiar magnetism that draws people to scenes of unresolved tragedy where answers might be hiding in plain sight among familiar surroundings. Uncomfortable encounters. Mrs. Penrose was methodically checking the parish inventory with unusual thoroughness, her efficient manner betraying an underlying anxiety as she counted candlesticks and verified communion silver. "One must ensure everything is properly accounted for," she explained when Miss Marple expressed admiration for her diligence. "Recent events have reminded us that we cannot be too careful about our responsibilities." Her emphasis on accountability struck Miss Marple as significant, particularly when combined with her nervous glances toward the bell tower door. The vicar's wife had always been scrupulously honest, but her current behavior suggested someone verifying that irregularities hadn't been discovered rather than simply maintaining good order. Mr. Pottle emerged from the vestry carrying a cloth bag that clinked softly with each step, explaining hurriedly that he was removing surplus items that had accumulated over recent months. His usual fussiness had intensified into something approaching panic, and his hands shook slightly as he fumbled with the bag's drawstring. When Miss Marple politely inquired about the contents, his response was evasive and accompanied by that telltale flush that indicates deception poorly concealed. The bell tower's secrets. Jack Briggs appeared at the tower door with his recovered keys, claiming he needed to inspect the bells for damage after their enforced silence. His explanation seemed reasonable until Miss Marple noticed the strong scent of photographic chemicals clinging to his clothes, an odd aroma for someone whose work involved only ropes and bronze. "Alfred was helping me with some maintenance work," he admitted grudgingly when pressed. "Boy had good hands, steady nerves, useful for delicate operations that require discretion." His choice of words seemed oddly clinical for bell maintenance, and his defensive posture suggested activities that wouldn't bear close scrutiny. Martin Dale's arrival completed the gathering, his camera bag conspicuously absent, and his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled agitation. "I've come to collect some equipment I stored here temporarily," he announced, though his eyes kept darting toward the tower entrance with unmistakable anxiety. Photography supplies are sensitive to temperature changes. The church provides ideal storage conditions. Revelations and accusations. The tension that had been building since Alfred's death finally erupted when Miss Eleanor Gray discovered Dale attempting to access the tower. "You have no business there," she declared with righteous indignation. "That boy spent far too much time in your company, and now we discover you've been using church property for your own purposes without proper authorization." Dale's response revealed more than he intended. Alfred understood the importance of discretion. He knew that artistic work requires privacy, that not everyone appreciates the dedication necessary for truly professional results. His defensive tone carried an undertone of something that made Miss Marple's blood run cold, the particular way predators justify their manipulation of children's trust. Mrs. Winter's arrival, drawn by the raised voices, provided the most damning revelation. "Alfred had been asking strange questions lately," she said, her grief-strained voice carrying new uncertainty. "About whether promises made to adults always had to be kept, even when keeping them felt wrong. He said someone had explained that special opportunities required special secrecy, but he was starting to doubt whether that was true." The pattern emerges. Miss Marple began to understand the complex web of activities that had centered around the bell tower and involved Alfred as an unwitting participant. The boy's natural honesty and growing moral awareness had made him increasingly uncomfortable with adult requests for secrecy, particularly as his voice change approached and his special status in the choir, and whatever other activities required his cooperation, was ending. Briggs's access to the tower, combined with Dale's photographic equipment and Pottle's nervous management of surplus items, suggested a coordinated operation that had required Alfred's assistance and silence. The boy's recent anxiety stemmed not from performance pressure, as everyone had assumed, but from his growing understanding that the adults he trusted were asking him to participate in activities that violated his natural sense of right and wrong. The fatal calculation, the throat pastilles, Miss Marple realized, had been the perfect murder weapon because they provided both the means of delivery and the logical explanation for their presence. Someone with intimate knowledge of Alfred's routines and preferences had calculated exactly how to exploit his dedication to his final performance while ensuring his permanent silence about whatever secrets he had been keeping. The improvised paper funnel, torn from Miss Gray's missing music, demonstrated quick thinking under pressure when Alfred's resolve to speak out became apparent. The killer had acted swiftly during the brief window when the boy's lemonade sat unattended, using whatever materials were available to deliver the fatal dose while maintaining the appearance of natural tragedy. Multiple motives, converging. As the various villagers continued their uncomfortable explanations and defensive justifications, Miss Marple observed that each had reasons to fear Alfred's growing reluctance to maintain adult secrets. Whether the activities involved financial irregularities, inappropriate photography, or other forms of exploitation, the boy's approaching voice change and increasing moral awareness had transformed him from compliant assistant to dangerous witness. The village's eager embrace of Hart as the obvious suspect had provided perfect cover for the true perpetrator, allowing someone with deeper community connections to escape scrutiny while disposing of evidence and deflecting suspicion onto the convenient outsider. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the various participants dispersed with their secrets partially exposed but not fully revealed, Miss Marple reflected on the particular evil of crimes that exploit children's natural desire to please adults. Alfred Winter had died not because he threatened to expose a single secret, but because his growing conscience had made him unreliable as a keeper of multiple adult deceptions, a liability that someone had calculated was too dangerous to allow to continue. The investigation had moved beyond the comfortable realm of obvious suspects into the more treacherous territory of coordinated deception and carefully maintained facades. Someone in Ashdown St. Luke had orchestrated Alfred's death with clinical precision, and Miss Marple was beginning to understand exactly who possessed both the necessary knowledge and the ruthless determination to silence a child's inconvenient honesty forever. The village had settled into a brittle normalcy by Tuesday morning, the sort of determined routine that follows tragedy and hopes to domesticate it through familiar activities. Miss Marple, returning a borrowed prayer book to the vestry, discovered she was not alone in seeking solace within St. Bartholomew's walls. Several villagers had gathered with various explanations for their presence, each claiming urgent business that seemed curiously coincidental given recent events. The second strike. Mrs. Penrose was conducting an inventory with unusual thoroughness when Mr. Pottle appeared, carrying his cleaning supplies and complaining of parched throat after his morning exertions. "I'll prepare some refreshment," Mrs. Penrose offered with characteristic efficiency, producing a pitcher of barley water and a bowl of sugar from the parish. Supplies. One must maintain proper standards, particularly during difficult times. Miss Marple watched with the quiet attention that had served her well in previous mysteries as Pottle gratefully accepted the offered drink, stirring in 2 generous spoonfuls of sugar before draining the glass with obvious relief. Within minutes, however, his complaints about the liquid's odd taste transformed into something more alarming. His face grew pale, his movements became unsteady, and he collapsed onto the vestry chair with the same bewildered expression Alfred had worn in his final moments. The familiar chaos of smelling salts and urgent ministrations followed, but Miss Marple remained focused on the evidence before her. The sugar bowl, when examined discreetly, revealed the same medicinal scent she had detected near Alfred's body. Menthol and eucalyptus masked among innocent white crystals. More significantly, several irregular, translucent grains caught the light differently, suggesting deliberate contamination rather than accidental mixing. The photographic evidence. While others attended to Pottle's recovery, Miss Marple's systematic examination of the vestry revealed additional evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Hidden beneath loose floorboards near the window, she discovered a cache of photographic plates showing detailed images of church silver, chalices, patens, and communion vessels arranged on black velvet with careful attention to their most valuable details. Penciled notations along the margins bore figures that resembled prices rather than dates, suggesting systematic documentation for purposes far removed from parish records. The makeshift dark-room equipment tucked behind the organ bench confirmed her growing understanding of the bell tower's true purpose. Chemical stains on wooden surfaces, improvised developing trays, and the lingering scent of photographic solutions revealed activities that required both Alfred's assistance and absolute secrecy. The boys' special opportunities and important work had involved not bell maintenance, but the careful documentation and removal of church treasures. Financial revelations. Mrs. Winter's arrival, drawn by the commotion surrounding Pottle's collapse, provided the final piece of the puzzle. Alfred had been asking questions about the collection money, she revealed with dawning horror. He helped count it sometimes, and he'd noticed discrepancies between what was collected and what was recorded. He thought he was making mistakes at first, but lately he'd been wondering if grown-ups sometimes made errors on purpose. This revelation illuminated Alfred's recent anxiety with terrible clarity. The boy's natural honesty and improving mathematical skills had made him increasingly uncomfortable with irregularities he was asked to ignore. His questions about keeping promises to adults reflected his growing understanding that he was being asked to participate in systematic deception that violated his moral compass. The coordinated conspiracy. The pattern that emerged showed not a single crime, but a coordinated operation involving multiple participants, each contributing essential elements to the scheme. Pottle's access to church property, Briggs's control of the bell tower, Dale's photographic expertise, and Mrs. Penrose's administrative authority had combined to create a system of theft disguised as legitimate parish business. Alfred's role had been crucial, but increasingly uncomfortable for someone with his natural integrity. His questions about financial discrepancies, his growing reluctance to maintain secrets, and his approaching voice change that would end his special choir. Privileges had transformed him from useful accomplice to dangerous liability. The fatal decision. Miss Marple understood that the second poisoning attempt proved the killer remained present and active, willing to strike again when threatened with exposure. Pottle's survival, whether by luck or incomplete dosage, had revealed the method while demonstrating the perpetrator's continued presence among them. The throat pastilles, dissolved in Alfred's lemonade during that fatal performance, had provided both the perfect murder weapon and the logical explanation for their medicinal presence. The improvised paper funnel, torn from Miss Gray's missing music, had demonstrated quick thinking under pressure when Alfred's resolve to speak out became apparent. The killer had acted with clinical precision, using the boy's own dedication to his final performance to mask the administration of a fatal dose, while ensuring the death appeared entirely natural. As evening shadows lengthened and the various participants dispersed with their secrets partially exposed, Miss Marple reflected on the particular evil of crimes that exploit children's natural trust in adult authority. Alfred Winter had died, not because he threatened to expose a single secret, but because his developing conscience had made him unreliable as a keeper of coordinated adult deceptions, a liability that someone had calculated was too dangerous to allow to continue. The investigation had moved beyond comfortable assumptions into the treacherous territory of coordinated deception and carefully maintained facades. Someone in Ashdown St. Luke had orchestrated Alfred's death with methodical precision, and Miss Marple was beginning to understand exactly who possessed both the necessary knowledge and the ruthless determination to silence a child's inconvenient honesty forever. Inspector Craddock arrived from Market Hafton shortly after tea time, his tall, spare frame and methodical demeanor bringing the weight of official authority to what had been treated as village tragedy. Unlike Constable Williams, who had been content with comfortable explanations, Craddock possessed the skeptical eye of someone who understood that tidy conclusions often concealed untidy truths. His first action was to secure the contaminated sugar bowl from the vestry, ordering it replaced while ensuring no one else would risk Pottle's fate. Official investigation begins. The inspector's systematic examination revealed disturbing irregularities that transformed suspicion into certainty. In Mrs. Penrose's meticulously maintained parish records, he discovered an insurance authorization bearing Lady Templeton's signature, granting Martindale permission to photograph church valuables for documentation purposes. When questioned, Lady Templeton confirmed the signature's authenticity, while admitting she rarely examined such administrative details, preferring to trust Mrs. Penrose's judgment entirely. The vestry safe, when opened under Craddock's supervision, told its own story of systematic deception. While the old, battered chalice remained in its accustomed place, the newer and considerably more valuable communion set had vanished. According to the ledger entries in Mrs. Penrose's precise handwriting, the pieces had been dispatched to a silversmith for cleaning and repair, though no receipt could be located to verify this claim. "I sometimes keep valuable items at the vicarage temporarily," Mrs. Penrose explained, her usual composure showing the first signs of strain, "to avoid confusion during maintenance periods." Her defensive tone suggested someone who knew her careful explanations would not bear close scrutiny. The bell tower's secrets revealed. The discovery of Martindale's photographic equipment hidden beneath loose floorboards confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the bell tower's true purpose. Detailed plates showed systematic documentation of church silver arranged against black velvet, with penciled notations that resembled auction estimates rather than parish inventory numbers. Chemical stains on wooden surfaces and improvised developing equipment revealed the space had been converted into a makeshift darkroom for documenting valuable items before their removal. Jack Briggs' nervous hovering near the tower door betrayed his knowledge of these activities, particularly when chemical stains on his clothing contradicted his claims of simple bell maintenance. His admission that he had provided Alfred with a spare key for convenience took on sinister implications when connected to the boy's recent anxiety about adult secrets. Evidence destroyed. Their investigation was interrupted by the acrid scent of burning chemicals drifting from the tower. Inside, they discovered the systematic destruction of evidence, twisted developing trays, charred photographic plates, and a parish towel reduced to gray ash. The fire had been recently set, suggesting someone had acted quickly to eliminate incriminating materials after Portal's poisoning attempt revealed the continued danger. Martin Dale's immediate claim of accident rang hollow when examination showed no soot on his clothing, while Briggs's sleeves bore telltale chemical smears. Mrs. Penrose studied the destroyed evidence with the fixed attention of someone calculating losses that extended far beyond photographic supplies. Miss Marple's psychological testing. While Craddock conducted his official investigation, Miss Marple employed more subtle methods to expose the conspiracy's full extent. Her approach involved carefully applied psychological pressure, using seemingly innocent observations to force guilty reactions from those involved in Alfred's death. With Mrs. Winter, she explored Alfred's recent concerns about collection money discrepancies. He'd been asking whether promises to adults always had to be kept. Mrs. Winter revealed with dawning horror, especially when keeping them felt wrong. He said someone had explained that special opportunities required special secrecy, but he was starting to doubt whether that was true. This revelation illuminated Alfred's final weeks with terrible clarity. His natural honesty and improving mathematical skills had made him increasingly uncomfortable with the systematic theft he was being asked to facilitate through his access to church funds and property. Individual reactions. Under pressure, each suspect's response to subtle questioning revealed their level of involvement and current desperation. Mrs. Penrose's defensive explanations about record-keeping became increasingly strained, her usual efficiency transforming into barely controlled panic as she realized how thoroughly their deception had been exposed. Briggs proved most susceptible to pressure, his earlier cooperation with the theft operation having left him vulnerable to exposure. When Miss Marple mentioned Alfred's frequent tower visits, his defensive response revealed both guilt and growing fear. "Boys shouldn't be wandering about unsupervised," he declared with excessive vehemence, his slip about Alfred knowing too much for his own good, betraying dangerous knowledge of the boys' threat to their operation. Martin Dale's behavior under questioning proved most illuminating of all. His nervous energy and repeated glances toward the bell tower revealed continuing anxiety about undiscovered evidence, while his defensive protests about equipment storage suggested someone who feared exposure of activities that could not bear scrutiny. The villagers' collective unease. The second poisoning attempt had shattered the comfortable assumption that Alfred's death was natural, replacing grief with a palpable fear that a murderer walked among familiar faces. The villagers who had eagerly blamed the outsider heart now looked at each other with suspicion, understanding that someone they trusted had been willing to kill a child to protect their secrets. This shift in atmosphere served Miss Marple's purposes perfectly, as fear often loosened tongues and frayed nerves that had previously maintained careful facades. The conspiracy's members found themselves isolated from the community support they had counted on, forced to rely on increasingly desperate measures to maintain their deception. Setting the final trap. As evening approached and the various participants dispersed with their secrets partially exposed, Miss Marple made her final preparations. She arranged with Lady Templeton for a memorial choir practice on Thursday evening, ostensibly to provide comfort by completing Alfred's interrupted Nunc Dimittis. The suggestion was met with revealing reactions. Mrs. Penrose's too quick agreement, Dale's immediate excuse to avoid attendance, and Briggs' defensive comment about bells being reserved for Sundays. The arrangement served a deeper purpose than comfort. Miss Marple had learned that murder often revealed itself when familiar patterns were restored, forcing the killer to react to situations that reminded them of their crime. By recreating the circumstances of Alfred's death, she hoped to provoke the final reaction that would expose the truth completely. As Inspector Craddock prepared for the evening's revelation, Miss Marple reflected on the particular evil of adults who exploit children's natural trust in authority. Alfred Winter had died not because he posed an immediate threat, but because his developing conscience had made him unreliable as a keeper of coordinated deceptions, a liability that someone had calculated was too dangerous to allow to continue. The psychological trap had been set, the evidence gathered, and the killer's desperation exposed. Now came the moment for final revelation and justice for a boy whose only crime had been growing too honest for the adults who had corrupted his trust. Thursday evening brought a peculiar stillness to St. Bartholomew's, the kind of expectant hush that precedes either prayer or revelation. The memorial choir practice had been Miss Marple's suggestion, offered with the gentle insistence of an elderly lady who believed comfort could be found in completing what tragedy had interrupted. The villagers had gathered with varying degrees of reluctance, each carrying their own burden of knowledge about Alfred Winter's final performance. The stage is set. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the organ with the unassuming air of someone seeking solace through familiar ritual, though her keen eyes catalogued every entrance and expression. Inspector Craddock occupied the shadows near the bell tower, his presence officially explained as ensuring no further incidents would disturb the memorial service. The remaining choir boys, subdued but dutiful, had assembled in their blue cassocks, creating a poignant echo of that fatal evening. Mrs. Penrose moved about the vestry with her characteristic efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged the music stands. The vicar's wife had insisted on preparing refreshments, claiming it would provide comfort during what promised to be an emotional evening. Her attention to the sugar bowl seemed particularly meticulous, measuring and adjusting with unnecessary precision. The psychological web begins. "Such a conscientious boy, young Alfred," Miss Marple observed to no one in particular, her voice carrying the conversational tone of someone making idle reminiscences. His mother mentioned how troubled he'd become recently about keeping promises to adults, particularly when those promises involved matters he didn't fully understand. The effect rippled through the small gathering like a stone dropped in still water. Mrs. Penrose's hands stilled momentarily on the tea service, while Martin Dale shifted uncomfortably in his rear pew. Jack Briggs, hovering near the tower door, found sudden interest in examining his boots. Miss Marple continued with seeming innocence. "Children have such clear moral compasses, don't they? When something troubles their conscience, they often seek ways to resolve the conflict without breaking their word directly." Alfred had been asking his mother whether writing things down counted as telling secrets. The trap is baited. From her handbag, Miss Marple produced a small leather-bound notebook, placing it casually on Alfred's former music stand. "I found this among his things," she mentioned, though Inspector Craddock knew perfectly well the book had been purchased that very afternoon. Children sometimes record their thoughts when they're wrestling with difficult decisions. The notebook's presence had an immediate and telling effect. Mrs. Penrose's careful composure cracked visibly, her eyes darting between the book and the faces around her, calculating who might have seen its contents. Dale leaned forward unconsciously, then caught himself and settled back with forced nonchalance. "Of course," Miss Marple added with gentle concern, "one hopes there's nothing in it that would distress anyone further. Alfred was so observant about church matters, the collection counting, the inventory work, those special projects in the bell tower that required such discretion." Mounting pressure, As Miss Grey began the opening chords of the Nunc Dimittis, Miss Marple's seemingly random observations grew more pointed. She spoke of children's natural honesty, of their distress when asked to participate in activities that violated their moral understanding of the particular burden Alfred had carried in his final weeks. He'd been asking such thoughtful questions lately, she mused, watching Mrs. Penrose's increasingly rigid posture, about whether promises made under false pretenses were still binding, whether loyalty to adults should override conscience, whether writing down the truth was the same as telling it. The music provided an ironic counterpoint to the mounting tension, Alfred's absent voice seeming to echo in the spaces between notes. Mrs. Penrose's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her usual efficiency replaced by barely controlled anxiety. The critical moment. "Perhaps some refreshment would be appropriate," Mrs. Penrose announced with forced brightness, moving toward the tea service she had prepared. Alfred always enjoyed a glass of lemonade before his solos. Miss Marple watched with the quiet attention of someone who understood the significance of repeated patterns. How thoughtful. Though I believe Alfred's mother mentioned he preferred his drinks unsweetened, something about not wanting to dull his palate before singing. Mrs. Penrose's hand hesitated over the sugar bowl, a barely perceptible pause that spoke volumes to those who knew what to observe. Inspector Craddock, from his position in the shadows, noted the hair-fine thread balanced across the bowl's rim, Miss Marple's subtle trap to detect interference. "Still," Miss Marple continued conversationally, "I suppose habits vary. Some people do have a tendency to add sweetening, particularly when they wish to mask other flavors. Medicinal tastes can be so unpleasant, can't they?" The trap springs. The psychological pressure had reached its breaking point. Mrs. Penrose's careful facade crumbled as she reached for the sugar bowl, her movements betraying the desperate calculation of someone whose world was collapsing around carefully maintained lies. The hair thread broke as she lifted the lid, drifting down like a silent accusation. With trembling hands, she measured sugar into a glass of lemonade, her actions driven by the same fatal compulsion that had led her to poison Alfred. Miss Marple watched with the patient attention of someone who had seen this pattern before, the repetition of criminal behavior under psychological stress. "For Timothy," Mrs. Penrose announced, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining normalcy. A little refreshment before attempting that difficult passage. But as she moved toward the boy with the prepared glass, Miss Marple's gentle hand intercepted her path. "How very kind," she said with mild firmness, taking the glass with the authority of someone who would not be refused. "Though perhaps we should let the music speak for itself this evening." The web tightens. Inspector Craddock stepped from the shadows, his movement deliberate but unhurried. The broken thread, the prepared glass, the pattern of behavior, all formed a web of evidence that spoke more clearly than any confession. Mrs. Penrose stood frozen, the glass still in Miss Marple's steady grasp, her face reflecting the terrible understanding that her carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed. "I think," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty, "that we have learned quite enough for this evening. The truth has a way of revealing itself, doesn't it, when one simply provides the proper circumstances for its emergence." The memorial service had become something else entirely, a final test that had exposed the killer's continued willingness to murder, even in the sacred space where her first victim had fallen. As the last notes of the Nunc Dimittis faded into silence, Miss Marple reflected that Alfred Winter's voice had, in its absence, finally spoken the truth that would bring his killer to justice. The revelation was complete, though the full explanation would wait for tomorrow's formal proceedings. Tonight, it was enough that the trap had been sprung, and the truth, like Alfred's pure treble, had risen clear and unmistakable above the discord of human deception. The morning brought a deliberate grey light to the vicarage drawing-room, where Inspector Craddock had assembled those most intimately concerned with the truth of Alfred Winter's death. The tea service sat untouched on its silver tray, a bitter irony given the events that had led them to this moment. Mrs. Penrose occupied the chair of accusation with characteristic composure, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her carefully folded hands. Martin Dale studied his boots with excessive concentration, while Jack Briggs stared through the window at the churchyard, where Alfred now lay beneath fresh earth. The evidence speaks. Miss Marple began with the gentle authority of someone who had observed human nature's darker patterns across many villages and many tragedies. It began with a scent that did not belong, not the familiar mixture of beeswax and hymn books one expects in a church, but something medicinal and sharp. Menthol and eucalyptus, quite out of place around a boy who was known to dislike throat remedies. She turned to Inspector Craddock, who produced the evidence with methodical precision. The laboratory analysis confirms potassium cyanide in both the contaminated sugar bowl and the residue from Alfred's music stand. The compound, as Mr. Dale well knows, is common in certain photographic developing processes, particularly the older formulas that produce the finest detail in documentation work. Dale's face went ashen, but Miss Marple continued with inexorable logic. The tackiness on Alfred's music stand told its own story. Water leaves no sugar, yet there were crystalline grains that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. The missing page from Miss Gray's Nunc Dimittis arrangement was not misplaced through carelessness. It was torn deliberately to create a makeshift funnel, its tip stiff from substances that had dried and crystallized. The conspiracy revealed. The crime began with systematic theft from church funds and property, Miss Marple explained, her mild voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Mrs. Penrose, through her position of administrative trust, had created a sophisticated operation that required multiple participants. Her meticulous record-keeping, which we all so admired, provided perfect cover for financial irregularities that could be explained as clerical errors or temporary relocations of valuable items. Inspector Craddock displayed the photographic plates recovered from the bell tower's makeshift dark room. Mr. Dale's expertise created detailed documentation of church silver and valuables, complete with notations that were clearly auction estimates rather than inventory numbers. Mr. Briggs provided access to the bell tower, which served as both storage facility and photographic studio. The isolation and his control of the keys made it perfect for activities requiring absolute discretion. The evidence mounted systematically. Doctored ledgers in Mrs. Penrose's precise handwriting, insurance authorizations bearing Lady Templeton's unwitting signature, chemical equipment hidden beneath loose floorboards. Each piece demonstrated the sophisticated nature of an operation that had required Alfred's unwitting assistance and absolute silence. Alfred's fatal honesty. Young Alfred Winter became invaluable to this conspiracy through his natural qualities, his mathematical aptitude, his access to collection counting, and his trusted position in the choir, Miss Marple continued, her voice growing gentler as she spoke of the murdered boy. However, those same qualities that made him useful ultimately made him dangerous. His developing moral compass began asserting itself as he noticed discrepancies between collected and recorded amounts. Mrs. Winter, her grief now mixed with terrible understanding, spoke with a mother's certainty. He'd been asking whether promises to adults were always binding, especially when keeping them felt morally wrong. Alfred was trying to find a way to do right without technically breaking his word to people he trusted. Miss Marple nodded with profound sympathy. Children possess remarkably clear moral compasses, and Alfred's was becoming increasingly disturbed by activities he was asked to facilitate. His questions about writing things down versus telling secrets directly suggested he was seeking ways to resolve his ethical conflict. The notebook I produced during our memorial service, though actually purchased as psychological bait, revealed Mrs. Penrose's desperate fear that Alfred had indeed documented what he had witnessed. The murder method. The throat pastilles provided the perfect murder weapon because they offered both means of delivery and logical explanation for their presence, Miss Marple explained with clinical precision. Mrs. Penrose dissolved the menthol lozenges in Alfred's lemonade to mask the bitter taste of the cyanide crystals she had obtained from Mr. Dale's photographic supplies. The medicinal scent would seem entirely appropriate for a young singer preparing for a demanding solo. Inspector Craddock confirmed the technical details. The dosage was carefully calculated for a child of Alfred's size and weight. The cyanide would have acted within minutes, causing respiratory failure that would appear to be vocal strain during that sustained high note. The improvised paper funnel, torn from Miss Gray's missing music, allowed precise delivery of the granular poison without spillage or detection. The psychological trap. The memorial service trap succeeded because guilty minds often repeat their crimes when faced with similar circumstances, Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Penrose's attempt to poison young Timothy with the same method revealed both her continued willingness to murder and her inability to resist the compulsion that had driven her to kill Alfred. The broken hair thread that had betrayed Mrs. Penrose's interference with the sugar bowl lay sealed in its evidence envelope, a tiny detail that had exposed a killer's desperate calculation. Her reach for the contaminated sugar, driven by the same fatal impulse that had silenced Alfred, had provided the final proof of her guilt. Justice and aftermath. As Inspector Craddock formally charged Mrs. Penrose with murder and her accomplices with conspiracy and theft, the vicar's wife maintained her dignity to the last. "There are sandwiches in the larder for the choir boys," she said with heart-breaking practicality. "Someone must think of the necessities." Then, meeting Miss Marple's gentle gaze, she added quietly, "You make wickedness sound so small." "It begins small," Miss Marple replied with infinite sadness. "That is its favorite disguise." The village heals. The weeks that followed brought a soft, shame-faced quiet to Ashdown St. Luke, as the community struggled to comprehend how trusted figures had betrayed their faith so completely. Lady Templeton repudiated all administrative committees for a fortnight before returning with increased vigilance over signatures and authorizations. The bell tower keys passed to the vicar's direct control, while Mr. Pottle scrubbed the chancel stones on his knees, weeping into the flagstones when he thought himself unobserved. At Alfred Winter's funeral, the choir sang the Nunc Dimittis without a descant, Miss Gray's hands steady and sure on the organ keys. Mrs. Winter stood very still, a woman who had learned that the world contains odd mercies even when none are immediately visible. The village lined the path with white foxgloves from cottage gardens, and no one spoke of natural causes. Miss Marple's reflection. Before returning to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Pierce and discussed roses, jam, and whether the tower might yet be restored through honest appeals rather than desperate measures. "It will be slower," she observed, watching the church through the window, "and therefore more sound. Things built upon truth tend to last longer." During her journey home, she reflected on the peculiar economy of human sin, how the desired tidy one balance could cost a life, how people convinced themselves that charitable ends justified temporary means, until neither charity nor honesty survived. She thought of Alfred, who had tried so hard to do right, and of a woman who had chosen order over integrity until both were lost forever. At St. Mary Mead, a robin tugged a worm from her lawn with brisk efficiency, and Miss Marple smiled at its honest perseverance. That evening, she said her prayers with particular attention to children who keep secrets for adults, asking that they might find the courage to speak truth when silence becomes complicity in evil. The choir boy who died at midnight had finally found his voice in death, speaking through the evidence he had unknowingly left behind and the moral clarity that had made him too dangerous for those who had corrupted his trust. In the end, Alfred Winter's pure treble had risen above the discord of human deception, carrying the truth that would bring his killers to justice and restore, in some small measure, the order they had sought to preserve through murder. The courthouse at Market Hafton possessed that particular gravity of English justice, its oak panelling creating an atmosphere where truth emerged through proper procedure. Mrs. Penrose sat in the dock with characteristic composure, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her carefully folded hands. The trial proceeded with methodical precision. The contaminated sugar bowl, the photographic plates bearing auction estimates, the chemical residue from the bell tower's makeshift darkroom, all speaking to a conspiracy that had demanded Alfred Winter's silence through murder. Justice served. The prosecution's case proved unassailable. Mrs. Winter's testimony about Alfred's growing distress over adult secrets, Timothy Fletcher's precise recollection of Alfred's cryptic warnings about grown-ups doing things that weren't right, even in church, and Miss Eleanor Gray's evidence of the deliberately torn page that had served as a poison funnel, all combined to create an irrefutable narrative of calculated murder. Mrs. Penrose received life imprisonment, her composed demeanor never wavering even as the judge spoke with particular revulsion about crimes that exploited childhood trust. Martin Dale and Jack Briggs received substantial sentences for conspiracy and theft, their shame a palpable thing that clung to them in the dock. The recovered church property was returned to St. Bartholomew's, though the community struggled with knowledge that their most trusted administrators had systematically betrayed their faith. The village heals. Summer advanced upon Ashdown St. Luke with unhurried decency, as if the season understood that gentleness was the village's chief requirement. The tower clock, repaired at last through honest subscription, sounded the hours with a sober, reconciled tone. People spoke more softly, now, not from fear, but from shared understanding that ordinary life is a delicate instrument requiring careful tuning. Mr. Felix Hart returned to his duties with humility that suited him, his fashionable self-assurance tempered by sorrow and gratitude. He and Miss Gray discovered the solidarity that comes to craftsmen who have stood where tragedy fell. Their rehearsals grew quieter, their tempos fractionally slower, and when descant lines came, they were offered by a single recorder, whose fragile sweetness honored the absence it acknowledged. Mrs. Winter kept the post office with measured calm, a woman who had learned to place one packet of sorrow upon another until shelves made sense again. Letters arrived addressed to Alfred for weeks, competition photographs, choir festival circulars delayed in post, and she returned them with neat notes in her precise hand. On Sundays, she sat beneath the north window, where the stone angel wore an expression that might be grief or patience, singing hymns very softly. Lessons learned. Lady Templeton, fortified by the salutary shock of signatures given too freely, instituted new rules requiring 2 independent witnesses for all documents. Mr. Pottle had resigned with a letter confessing not to theft, but to cowardice, the kind that notices irregular parcels and looks away. Inspector Craddock accepted the resignation without triumph. Miss Marple, finding the man weeping beside the font, told him truthfully that beginnings toward courage are seldom tidy. The choir boys, suddenly attentive to rules they had once treated as suggestions, watched Mr. Hart with complicated loyalty, resentment for strictness braided with relief that adults could sometimes be entirely good. He set new boundaries with quiet firmness, never rehearsing past twilight, making small ceremony of returning tower keys to the vicar after every practice. Miss Marple's final observations. On her final morning, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Pierce, discussing roses and whether the tower might yet be restored through honest appeals rather than desperate measures. "It will be slower," she observed, watching the church through the window, "and therefore more sound. Things built upon truth tend to last longer." Inspector Craddock brought her sweet peas from his sister's allotment and asked the question policemen ask when formality is done. "How did you know?" She counted on her fingers the things that didn't belong, the medicinal scent, the sugared ring that water couldn't make, the missing page shaped like a funnel, the frightened child speaking in exact phrases children use when trying to keep promises while telling truth simultaneously. People who love order beyond reason will do anything to preserve its appearance, she explained gently, even destroy the very order they claim to prize. Departure and reflection. As her train pulled away from the small country station, Miss Marple gazed at the distant spire of St. Bartholomew's. The village would recover, life, with its relentless rhythm, would continue. But it would never be quite the same. The gentle illusion of perfect tranquility had been replaced by stark knowledge that even in peaceful English villages, the human heart could harbor darkness. She thought of Alfred, of courage beginning in doubts, of a child's clear eye upon adult muddle, and prayed that goodness might learn to be as patient as wickedness is persistent. The choir boy who died at midnight had found his final voice through the evidence he left behind and the love of those who refused to let his truth be forgotten. At St. Mary Mead, a robin tugged a worm from her lawn with brisk efficiency, and Miss Marple smiled at its honest perseverance. That evening she said her prayers with particular attention to children who keep secrets for adults, asking that they might find courage to speak truth when silence becomes complicity in evil. The case was closed, justice served, and the village slowly learning that some voices, once silenced, find ways to speak again through the moral clarity they leave behind. A reminder that innocence, though vulnerable, possesses a strength that outlasts the evil seeking to destroy it. The first frost silvered the churchyard by late autumn, and Ashdown St. Luke settled into the quieter rhythm of a village that had learned uncomfortable truths about itself. The tower clock, repaired through honest subscription after the trial's conclusion, struck the hours with restored accuracy, its voice carrying across fields where harvest had been gathered and the earth prepared for winter's rest. People moved more thoughtfully now, not from lingering fear, but from shared understanding that trust, once shattered, required careful reconstruction through countless small acts of reliability. The community transforms. Mrs. Winter surprised everyone by accepting the position of church treasurer, bringing to financial matters the same meticulous honesty that had made her son's moral compass so reliable. Her ledgers bore no erasures, her accounts balanced to the penny, and when collection plates were counted, she insisted on witnesses whose integrity was beyond question. The post office continued under her steady management, letters sorted with the care of someone who understood that ordinary responsibilities, faithfully discharged, provided their own form of healing. Mr. Hart had found his place among them at last, his London sophistication softened by genuine humility and shared grief. He and Miss Eleanor Gray discovered the solidarity that comes to craftsmen who have weathered tragedy together. Their rehearsals grew quieter, their demands on the boys tempered by profound respect for childhood innocence. When descant lines arose in the music, they were offered by a single recorder whose fragile sweetness honored the absence it acknowledged, a gentle remembrance of the voice that would never sound again. Lady Templeton, chastened by revelation of her unwitting complicity, became a tireless advocate for transparency in all parish affairs. She instituted new regulations requiring 2 independent witnesses for every signature, her keen eye now scrutinizing ledgers with forensic intensity rather than social pleasantries. The very qualities that had made her vulnerable to exploitation, her trust in established authority, her preference for delegating administrative details, were transformed into protective vigilance that would safeguard future generations. Memorial and remembrance. A modest stone plaque appeared beneath the north window, cut with simple dignity. Alfred Winter, treble, followed by his brief dates. Nothing more was attempted in the way of explanation. The village understood that some truths required no elaboration. Children regarded it with the embarrassed reverence they reserved for realities larger than their vocabulary, while adults found in its simplicity a reminder that innocence, though vulnerable, possessed strength that outlasted the evil seeking to destroy it. Mrs. Pierce wrote to Miss Marple on notepaper bordered with tiny blue forget-me-nots, thanking her for ensuring justice was accomplished without sensational spectacle. The correspondence that followed spoke of small victories, the successful completion of honest fundraising, children playing once more in the churchyard, the gradual return of laughter to spaces where tragedy had fallen. "There is comfort," Mrs. Winter added in her own careful script, "in knowing that the bells ring because people saved for them honestly." Institutional safeguards. The conspiracy's exposure had revealed uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of institutions built on trust. Churches, with their reliance on voluntary service and community goodwill, proved particularly susceptible to exploitation by those who understood how to manipulate faith for personal gain. The new procedures implemented at St. Bartholomew's, dual signatures, witness transactions, regular independent audits, represented hard-won wisdom about the difference between healthy trust and dangerous naivety. Mr. Pottle had quietly submitted his resignation, citing not theft but cowardice, the kind that notices irregularities and chooses to look away. Inspector Craddock accepted it without triumph, understanding that shame could be its own form of justice. Miss Marple, finding the former verger weeping beside the font he had once so meticulously polished, told him truthfully that beginnings toward courage are seldom tidy, and that recognition of past failures often marks the start of future integrity. Miss Marple's final observations. Before her departure, Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Pierce one last time, discussing late roses and whether the village might yet complete its restoration through patient, honest effort. "It will be slower," she observed, watching the church spire through the window, "and therefore more sound. Things built upon truth tend to last longer than those constructed through shortcuts and deception." Inspector Craddock, bringing sweet peas from his sister's garden, asked the question policemen always pose when formalities conclude, "How did you know?" Miss Marple counted on her fingers the details that hadn't belonged. The medicinal scent where none should be, the sugared residue that water couldn't make, the missing page shaped into an improvised funnel, the frightened child speaking in the precise phrases children use when trying to honor promises while following conscience simultaneously. "People who love order beyond reason will do anything to preserve its appearance," she explained with gentle certainty. "Even destroy the very order they claim to prize." Mrs. Penrose's crime began with small compromises that seemed reasonable. Temporary loans, minor adjustments, gradual involvement of a trusting child in activities requiring discretion. Each step appeared manageable until the accumulated weight of deception demanded the ultimate sacrifice to maintain appearances. Departure and reflection. As her train pulled away from the small country station, Miss Marple gazed at the distant spire of St. Bartholomew's, its weathered stones catching the pale November light. The village would recover. Life, with its relentless rhythm, would continue. But it would never be quite the same. The comfortable illusion of perfect tranquility had been replaced by stark knowledge that even in peaceful English villages, the human heart could harbor calculated darkness. She thought of Alfred, of courage beginning in doubts, of a child's clear eye upon adult muddle, of moral clarity that had made him too dangerous for those who corrupted his trust. The boy who had tried so hard to do right, even when adults made righteousness difficult, had found his final voice through the evidence he left behind, and the love of those who refused to let his truth be forgotten. The lasting legacy. At St. Mary Mead, settling into her familiar chair with needlework and correspondence, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns that had emerged in Alfred Winter's case. The crime had revealed the particular cruelty of evil that exploited childhood trust, turning a boy's dedication to his church duties into the mechanism of his destruction. Yet it had also demonstrated the power of moral clarity to transcend death. speaking truth through carefully observed evidence and the testimony of those who recognized innocence when they encountered it. That evening, she offered quiet prayers for children everywhere who struggled to maintain their moral compass in a world where adults sometimes asked them to keep secrets that violated their natural sense of right and wrong. The choir boy who died at midnight had become, in his way, a guardian angel for other innocents who might face similar choices between loyalty and conscience, his sacrifice serving as protection through the vigilance his death had awakened. The case was closed, justice served, and a community slowly learning that some voices, once silenced, find ways to speak again through the moral clarity they leave behind. In the gathering winter dusk, Miss Marple understood that Alfred Winter's pure treble had risen above the discord of human deception, one final time, carrying the truth that would ensure his memory served as both warning and protection for generations yet to come.